Yeah, I remember when games were released for every home console and were released for the handhelds like Nintendo DS or Sony PSP, and you were excited for the game to come out, and the only console you owned at the time was a DS or PSP, and when you got your hands on a game, it was a totally different game. Sup guys, back in a new vid, and guys, I'm going to be covering the stupid handheld ports, misleading false advertisement that companies used to do.
What?
I know those words didn't sound good together, but the more I talk about it, the more you'll probably understand. Let's get into it. These games either had the same name as the home console version or released alongside the home console versions. They had the same name, but were kind of like a spin-off or different story. It's cool now that we don't get this kind of stuff because handheld consoles aren't being made anymore, and I'm sure companies would love doing this to the Switch to save money, but they think they can, then they forget that the Switch is both a home console and a handheld, but a home console at heart. So instead of making a whole different game, they have to rework the way the game runs and port it over to the Switch.
Oh man.
But now looking back at it, these were horrible for companies to do and very false advertising-y, if that makes sense. And it's crazy how many of these games there were. To name a few, we have Sonic Generations for the 3DS, Sonic Colors for the DS, Sonic Boom Fire and Ice for the 3DS, Iron Man 2 for the DS. We can't forget the Call of Duties for the DS. It's crazy at how they gave the games the same names and got away with robbing us kids blind. At least one I can state they did get right that I've played was Spider-Man Edge of Time for the 3DS. Just looking at the console version, it looked beautiful, but for the 3DS port, it looks significantly worse, but it's actually the console version just optimized to run on handheld. This is what game companies should be doing instead of making literal 3DS games into 2D side-scrollers like the Simpsons game or Spider-Man Web of Shadows. And I admit this is kind of a whole different game with reworked mechanics, but it's still not the console version. Now let's move over from handhelds onto last gen ports of games. So there was a time when the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and Wii were new, and in 2008 there was a game called Spider-Man Web of Shadows that released for all consoles and handhelds. And while the PS3, Xbox 360, and Wii were 3 years old at the time, PS2, GameCube, and Xbox were nearing the end of their life, while it's only been at least 5 years since these last gen consoles were out, and this was a different era for home consoles. Microsoft was onto their second console 4 years after their first one launched. Sony was competing with Microsoft by coming out with the PS3 a year later, better specs and hardware, so they're not outshadowed by Microsoft's Xbox 360 performance and hardware. And with Nintendo being Nintendo, with their consoles not being a powerhouse but still having all their beloved IPs, cancels out the specs and parts they were working with. They had the Wii at this time. So when Spider-Man Web of Shadows released, we expected the game to be the same on all consoles. Just for the PS2 and GameCube, that they would look a little less polished, but this was not the case. The last gens got were totally different games and not remotely close to the regular versions that were advertised. The PS2 version was literally a better looking version of the handheld versions, and the Wii was on par with the PS2's hardware. Since the Wii was considered next gen, they did what they should have done for the PS2 version and made the game a less better looking version of the Xbox 360 and PS3 version. This is kind of the same thing they do already when they release ports of newer or graphically intensive older games over to the Switch. Example being The Witcher 3, a game that came out in 2015 for Xbox One and PS4 and now ported over to the Switch. The game still runs at the same frame rate it does on those consoles and the resolution is lower, but the game was like crap, but it's still playable. So yeah, this is just my take on the whole false advertising scam companies used to get away with back in the day. If you agree or disagree, comment down below. I'll be sure to respond. With that, thanks for watching and see y'all later.